Last night, Jay Bouwmeester collapsed on the bench after coming up the ice, and his heart stopped beating. The medical staff promptly intervened and literally were able to save his life. Welcome back, everyone, to your #1 source for learning about everything related to sports injuries and sports medicine news. In this video, I'm going to be talking about what happened last night with Jay Bouwmeester in the NHL. We've since heard that Bouwmeester is doing well. He's remaining in the hospital for some additional tests, but the word today from the St. Louis Blues is that overall things are looking fairly positive. What I'm going to do in this video is walk you guys through kind of the sequence of what happened here and kind of take you inside the mind of what I would be thinking and doing as a medical provider in one of these situations. We'll talk briefly about some of the potential causes of cardiac arrest in this situation and then what could be next for Bouwmeester. Please go subscribe if you like watching this type of content and want to stay up to date with my future videos, and let's get started. During Bouwmeester's last shift on the ice, there was nothing at all concerning or alarming about how he acted or any sort of hits that he took. We of course then saw him suddenly collapse on the side of the bench, prompting the quick attention of the St. Louis Blues players to get the medical staff over there. As soon as this happens, the medical team is starting off on what we would call an evaluation of a collapsed athlete or evaluation of a downed athlete. The first step when you see anybody who's collapsed, including an athlete, is trying to assess their consciousness. Clearly here, Bouwmeester was unconscious. He was non-responsive, and so that prompts the next step, which is checking for a pulse. The first responders who are there will put their fingers up over the carotid pulse in the neck to check for signs that the heart is beating. Whether or not the athlete has a pulse determines which of two paths you're going to go down, with, of course, one of those paths being much more serious. Last night, the Blues told us that Bouwmeester had suffered a, quote, cardiac event, which really could mean anything from simply passing out or having cardiac arrest, which is what we found out he in fact had. Cardiac arrest is when the heart ceases its ability to pump and squeeze blood. If a downed athlete does not have a pulse, then they're in cardiac arrest, and that's when we start our life support measures. The most simple one that we saw the team doing right away was basic life support, or BLS. BLS involves chest compressions and resuscitative breathing. Whenever someone has cardiac arrest, their heart is not able to squeeze blood to the rest of their body, and so the damaging effects are because you get hypoxia or impaired oxygen supply to the necessary tissues like your brain and the muscles in the heart, and that causes death in those tissues. So by performing CPR and pumping on the sternum or pumping on the chest, what you're doing is you're compressing the rib cage to squeeze the heart to try to help the heart still be able to circulate some blood throughout the body. If we look closely in the video here, we can see one of the members of the medical team looking like he's performing CPR. We can see him moving up and down, and this was likely when they were doing CPR and trying to resuscitate him at this initial stage. Time to initiation of chest compressions is one of the key determining factors in the outcome of someone who has cardiac arrest. If you're out in the community or out somewhere where there's no defibrillator, then you simply continue doing your CPR. But you want to go try to find a defibrillator or an AED. An AED applies an electrical shock to the person's body that tries to reverse the abnormal arrhythmia to restore the ability of the heart to squeeze and pump blood. There's 4 primary things that are happening in the heart whenever someone has cardiac arrest. There's 2 specific arrhythmias called ventricular fibrillation and ventricular tachycardia, in which the heart electrical activity is still firing, but it's in a very irregular, kind of desynchronous way in which the heart's never actually able to squeeze. So there's all this electrical activity going on in the heart that looks really abnormal on an EKG, but it's preventing the heart from actually being able to squeeze. Both VT and VFib are what we call shockable rhythms, meaning if a defibrillator detects them, it will provide a shock to try to restore a regular rhythm. But 2 other possibilities are pulseless electrical activity, or PEA arrest, or just asystole. Asystole is basically when someone's heart is flatlined. Pulseless electrical activity is when the tracing actually looks like a normal heart rhythm, but there's no pulse that you can actually feel. With PEA arrest and asystole, you can't shock, you can't defibrillate. You can give medications and you keep doing CPR to try to ultimately get that heart rhythm and pumping to come back. There are other scenarios where you might have to use a defibrillator, but in a sort of different capacity. Sometimes a person could still have a pulse, but have a more unstable rhythm where their blood pressure is dropping, and in that case, you might do something called cardioversion, where you use a defibrillator, but apply a different type of electricity to try to restore that normal pattern of beating. So we can't say with 100% certainty what exactly was going on electrically within Bouwmeester's heart, whether or not it was one of these unstable rhythms that required defibrillation or something where he still had a pulse but needed to have what we would call cardioversion. As the medical team is performing CPR, the other thing they're going to be doing here is getting his equipment off as soon as possible. This is actually something we practice at the beginning of every season, whether it's football, hockey, or some other sport with protective gear. We practice how to remove this equipment so that we can get it off as effectively and quickly as possible. You're taking all this equipment off because you need to apply those AED pads onto the person's chest. This box that we can see sitting here on the side of the rink is probably the AED, and there's one point where one of the first responders has kind of these pads in his hand that he's pulling off, and so likely here right away, as soon as they're starting to do chest compressions, they're getting the AED ready, they're getting ready to put those pads on, so that as soon as it might be available, they'll be able to shock and defibrillate his heart. There's a whole process that we learn in medical school, residency, and continue with our training called ACLS. That stands for Advanced Cardiac Life Support, and it's basically like basic life support, but on steroids. This is an algorithm that we use that goes through when you're supposed to evaluate for a shockable rhythm, what medicines you're supposed to use, and all the potential causes of the cardiac arrest that you're supposed to consider. This is something that certainly the paramedics that are responding are going to be familiar with, and oftentimes some of the sports physicians themselves. The majority of time, though, cardiac arrest is caused by some sort of structural heart pathology. That might be something like a clot from a heart attack, or it could be something structural just with the size of the heart that predisposes it to different arrhythmias. Along that same pathway, some athletes have conditions where they're predisposed to irregular heart arrhythmias, which can then lead to these ones that cause cardiac arrest. You can also have causes outside of the heart, like a blood clot in the lungs that basically overwhelm the heart and cause the heart to become hypoxic, with death of those tissues because of lack of oxygen. It's hard to say for sure what's next for Bouwmeester here, but certainly anytime anybody has a cardiac arrest, even if they're not an athlete, they're going to have to go very, very extensive evaluations before being cleared to participate in any sort of physical activity. There's definitely a possibility here that this could cause Bouwmeester's career to be over, depending on what they find as the cause of this cardiac arrest episode. You hope that you're able to find something that's reversible and that you can intervene on to prevent this from happening again, as opposed to just kind of being left out in the dark, really wondering what might have caused it. Those first responders truly did save Bouwmeester's life, no exaggeration. There's a statistic that only around 10% of people survive if they've had cardiac arrest outside of a hospital. But that number significantly improves whenever CPR is done, and it's done early. CPR can truly be life-saving and is a skill that I think everybody should be responsible for learning. Even if you're not comfortable with the rescue breathing and you don't know the exact timing or the exact sequence of things, if you can simply go to someone who doesn't have a pulse and is down on the ground unresponsive and start pushing on their chest, it's better than nothing. Thank you as always though for watching, everyone. I hope you guys learned something here, just kind of about these events that transpired and kind of what's going on in the background and through all these providers' heads whenever they're evaluating an athlete like this. Let me know any questions or comments you have below, and until next time, we'll see you later.